going live. I'm going to post the link in Slack. We will send that out to everyone. So while people are joining, I'm going to pull up my live stream. Hello. Oh, there we go. I think this part gets put into the recording. So hi, future people. I don't think anyone's in the room yet. Oh, Twitch is showing me an ad for Doug and Rugrats. That's awesome. Hey, someone's saying hi in the chat room. Hi. Thank you for joining. I'm going to give some people a little bit of time to join. Let me put up my computer screen so you're not just staring at me. Boom. Hey, 8 people have already joined. I recognize the names too. Welcome again, everybody. Okay, so tonight I do have slides to cover some important concepts from both Chapter 11, which introduces CSS, and Chapter 12, which I don't intend to spend a lot of time on Chapter 12 because it's mostly a lot of examples of CSS. I'd rather focus on the bigger concepts. And then I was also thinking that we could take a look at the CSS 3 Ways challenge and maybe complete that on the recording tonight. Does anybody have any questions in the chat room? And now I dropped my phone, so I don't have the chat in here. There we go. Now I have the chat up. All right. Well, I don't see any questions yet, so I'm going to get started going over the slides. Oh, someone did post a question. The main thing that they wanted to see was the CSS 3 Ways, knowing what to do and how. Okay. Let me integrate that into the Chapter 11 presentation. So let me pull up the slides. So Chapter 11 is where we take the HTML that we've been working on for building a web page and set it aside because that's the important content on the page. Now we want to add another layer on top of it for controlling what it looks like. And I think this is the part of the semester where you're going to realize that you can build really cool looking websites with just a little bit of extra code on top of the content. So in Chapter 11, our author, Jennifer Simmons, tries to explain the benefit of CSS, go over some big concepts like how to write the rules, how the rules work, how the browser, when it is displaying a web page, actually handles a cascade, an overwhelming number of rules, and figures out what rules apply to each element. And then she also introduces some units of measurement and ways to think about every little element on the page in terms of the box model. So that's what Chapter 11 contains. I'm going to breeze through some parts of this because it's covered really well in the book, but there are some things that I wanted to call out. So why would you want to use CSS? Well, HTML a long time ago used to have a lot of other tags that have been deprecated or basically removed from being recommended to use. And those are tags like the font tag. There used to be a tag where you would specify when those font tags were around content, what font that content should be. But then if you wanted to make a change to your entire website, you would have to actually open up every HTML file and change those font tags. I used to do that. I used to make websites and I remember that font tag. It was a lot of manual upkeep. So the first goal of CSS was to make it a lot easier to apply a font or colors or a design to a website and keep all of those rules in one file, in a CSS file. So that was one of the goals of CSS, making our jobs as web designers a lot easier to maintain at scale websites. It also has the benefit of keeping a web page accessible because the presentation might not matter to a browser that's reading the content. So we don't need to muck up our wonderful code that tells us where the article is and where the headings are with extra font tags. And on top of that, browsers actually ship with the ability for you to customize the baseline CSS that applies to every web page. So if you wanted to specify a minimum font size as you're browsing the web, the way that you're doing that in your browser preferences is actually through a style sheet, which is pretty cool. Someone was making a joke about making a website really complex by adding a lot of tags, and that's how it was. So flexibility. The last key benefit of CSS is that it's actually possible to change the look of a web page without touching any of the HTML. And the very next slide here shows screenshots from the CSS Zen Garden. I love the site, and it turns out our author does too. The Zen Garden was an experiment many years ago that tried to convince people to ditch all the old HTML tags that allowed you to change what a web page looked like and instead use CSS. And this was the poster model for it. What you're seeing here, if I can remove my head, these three designs are actually the exact same HTML file. The only difference is they're each loading a different style sheet. So one of the authors wanted to have this green background and these beautiful white circles around the content. Another designer really liked this dinosaur, and it's kind of cool. And then another designer really changed the whole feel of the website by putting everything down a skinny, narrow column with white text on black. All that is possible just by changing CSS rules. And I love the Zen Garden so much that I'm trying to keep it alive, that for your midterm, you're actually going to be designing your own style sheet for the Zen Garden. Now, it turns out, as our author notes, that the Zen Garden is no more. The website exists, and you can go browse all the designs, but they're not accepting any new contributions at this point. But this is the flexibility and the power of CSS. We can make changes to the entire Midmish website by editing one CSS file, which is pretty cool. So how do style sheets work? Well, this is where the heart of the CSS 3 ways comes in. Regardless of how you include the CSS style sheet, whether it's external, internal, or inline, what you're going to have to get used to are writing these style rules. And the basic structure of a style rule, here are two examples. If I go to the next slide, I think this has the pieces of it, is CSS is a different language than HTML. And it kind of makes sense when you're including CSS styles on your HTML page. You don't want to have to write tags within tags. So CSS has this lighter weight, more powerful selector language where you will describe the content that you want to select, and then you provide a declaration that says what aspect of the HTML element you want to change its appearance of. So if I go back to this previous example, the selector in here is H1. Now that's actually not going to select just one H1. That's going to select all the H1s on the page. And it's going to change what? Their color, that's the property here, to green. So we wrote one line of CSS, and that could affect 6, 7, 8, an unknown number of H1 tags across your website and across that web page. Here's another selector. It selects all the strong elements, all the strong tags, and it changes their color, and it changes their font style to italic. Two little rules that can change an entire web page's design. But the basic structure is to provide a selector that's usually going to describe what you want to grab and change the style on, and then provide it the properties that you're changing. Now, it's hard to see potentially, but what you're actually looking at here, let me go to browser only. What you're seeing here on the left is an example where they wrote everything on one line. But CSS, it doesn't matter if there's how much white space you use or how little white space you use. You could write a rule all in one line like this, but what you're going to see much more commonly if you look at other people's work, or as you look at my work when I share it with you and I provide samples, is a format like this where people will write the selector on one line and then put the opening bracket. It's actually the curly brace or the curly bracket, and then the declarations individually go each on one line. Each declaration has to be broken up by a semicolon so that the browser knows where one begins and ends. And then there's the closing curly brace after all of the properties that you're specifying. But if you wanted to change several aspects of a paragraph tag, like its size, its color, you don't have to write multiple rules like this. You can actually just write one selector and list all of the things that you want to adjust. All right, so let's jump ahead here. There are lots of ways for you to select content. The most common in chapter 11 that you're going to work with are element selectors, where when you list the element that you want to select, like the P, you actually just put the tag name essentially, and that's going to select all the items like that. Now that's grabbing and casting a wide net. That's grabbing all the paragraphs on the page. More likely, you only want to affect a subset of those. So there are other selectors that you're going to use in the next few CSS chapters to select maybe just one element that has an ID of intro. This hashtag or this pound sign right here indicates that this is an ID selector. So rather than select a bunch of things, this is only going to select one thing on the page. The one thing on the page that has an ID, that's the ID attribute of intro. Scroll down here a little bit. All that we covered. If you're going to be working on a really long CSS file like we have for midmish.edu, it's pretty common for you to want to add comments. Sometimes you want to organize the rules, like maybe you have a bunch of rules that are related to coloring the nav bar, or that are going to be for the article section of your news site. That's pretty common for us. So we'll actually put CSS comments in between our rules so that we can break them up and explain what we've been doing. Okay, so at this point we're now ready to transition back to the first assignment, or the first challenge, which is the CSS 3 ways. The 3 ways that I want to have you comfortable with using CSS are external style sheets, embedded style sheets, and inline styles. All 3 of these I have used probably within the last month. I've used all 3 of these ways of including CSS. I think that some of these have really strong advantages and really clear disadvantages, but that being said, I found reasons to use all 3 approaches. So let's talk about them. The first one is the external style sheet. This is where you would actually write your CSS not in your HTML file at all. You would put it all in its own separate file, and then in each HTML file that you want to use those styles, you add a special tag, it's called the link tag, and you tell it which CSS file you want to load in. We'll show you that in a second. This is probably the most common way that a webmaster of a website will include CSS, because this is where that power comes in, where you can have one CSS file and just use it on every one of your HTML pages in a website. Then if you need to change something about your colors, like your company decides to go from one shade of red to another, you don't have to edit 500 different HTML files. You edit one CSS file, and the others will read that the browser will read that when they visit each one of your pages. Embedded style sheets are very, very flexible too. On an HTML page, if you want to just write some CSS rules, you can use the style tag to have a section of the head document, the head section of the HTML document, to allow you to write styles right on the web page. And you're going to see me doing this a lot, especially today when I'm demonstrating CSS for you, because I don't want to sometimes have 2 files. Inline styles are really powerful because they are a great way to override whatever other styling is on the web page. So an inline style changes how you write the CSS. Instead of putting it alone with a selector and the declaration block, you actually just write the styles the actual declarations that you want directly on the HTML element that you're trying to change its appearance of, and you put those CSS declarations inside the style attribute. So what does this look like? Well, let's pull up Atom, and I've downloaded the CSS 3 ways starter file. I'm gonna make it full screen here, bring up my video here so you can see me. This starter document has some hints, some little breadcrumbs left for you. I wanted you to insert CSS 3 ways on here, and the ultimate goal is to make this relatively boring web page. Let me pull it up here. Come on, Safari. The goal is to take this web page, pretty bland to start with, I promise, and then make it look more like this. Now, this is not the most beautiful web page in the world, but it does look a lot different, I think you'd agree. So we're going to try to write some CSS styles to change this into this screenshot. And chat room, I need your help here. What do you think we're going to want to change on here? What aspects, what do you see? What properties do you think we're going to have to adjust with CSS? So while I'm waiting for the chat room to give me some suggestions on what we have to style, I'll go back to the source code here because I left these little hints in here to point out where the certain tags would go. And actually, you know what? My hints are in the wrong place. Look at that. I think I intended for those hints to be inside of the head of the document. So let's pretend that those are there. Yes, someone asked in the chat room, are we trying to make it look like the screenshot? Yes. So we're trying to take this plain HTML file and write some styles 3 different ways that will turn it into this screenshot. It's the exact same text, it's just colored differently. So someone is pointing out color and centering. So someone's talking about the title, I think. So this section right here, welcome to the CSS 3 Ways Challenge. Definitely, that is one thing that we're going to want to change. And I think that this would be an interesting way for me to show you an inline style. If I scroll down to hint number 3, I actually left this for you. It says that this h1 tag might be a good place to try an inline style attribute. So let's try that right now. We know that the h1 is something that we want to be centered and red. So let's start with the color first. So let's write a style attribute. And as I go into this h1 tag, I have to put a space and then I can type style. And because I'm using Atom, it's actually going to autocomplete and I can hit enter and it puts the quotation marks that I need around here. Now inside of this attribute, this style attribute, is where our CSS goes. I don't have to write a selector because it's going to apply to this h1 element. So let's just start with something simple, the color. So the way a declaration looks, or the way that we write one, if I scroll back up to here, is we write a property, colon, and then the value that we want it to be. So with color, if you were to look that up in the book, we can provide color certain keywords. So we can make it red. And I'm still going to put a semicolon at the end so that our browser knows where the end of that rule is. I'm going to save it. Go back to my web page. The saving part is very important as you're making changes to your file. And then come over here and I'm going to click my little refresh button. And we're a little bit closer to the screenshot. It is now red. So does anyone know which CSS property we change to make the text centered? Because it seems like that's the next goal here. I think I saw someone contribute it already in the HTML database. Yeah, text align. So I'm going to just add a space in here and start typing text-align with the colon and then the keyword center and the semicolon. Now, to be honest, Atom is not doing a great job of auto-completing these style rules because it's inside of this style attribute. So we're going to switch away from inline styles. After I refresh this page, you're going to see that it's centered. And that's really all I'm looking for in terms of demonstrating inline styles, is that you know that you can put CSS in this style attribute. It is not something that real web designers do a lot of. This is like a last-ditch effort. If you're, I guess the number one place where I see myself use this is if I'm posting some content in Moodle, I don't have access to edit the style sheet. I don't have access to include style tags. But what I can do, if I go into the HTML mode of the forum editor or the news announcement, is I can actually edit the tags and I can put these style rules in an attribute. So I do see myself doing it from time to time, but it's usually when I'm putting content in a system I don't control. I personally prefer using embedded style sheets and external style sheets because this is really complicated. If there was another element on the page that I wanted to make red and centered, I'd have to rewrite that code later on. And I don't like that. I like writing it once and being able to reuse it. So let's look at that. Let's find another thing that we can change some styles on. Does anyone see another thing that we can style? What do you think about the bottom section here? Good luck looks like it changes drastically. It gets centered again, so we could use the text align. But it also has a different background color, and the text is a different color, and it's capitalized. Yeah. So let's work on this one. So we know that we want to change this good luck. Now, luckily, I left really good breadcrumb trails here. I left the good luck content inside of a div with a certain class. So if I wanted to target this, I can use a type of selector that is introduced in chapter 11, and I think it's shown in chapter 12 as well. We can write what's called a class selector. Where am I going to write this style? Well, I don't want to use inline style sheets, so I'm actually going to do an embedded style sheet next. So I am going to write the style tag, and Atom auto completes it for me. This HTML tag means that anything in between here is actually CSS. So I can write real CSS in here finally, and Atom is going to auto complete it. So if I wanted to target the div with a class of good luck, you might think, well, let's just start typing div, right? And let's have that opening and curly brace like I showed you in the screenshot. And let's write our first rule. Let's do text align center. Let me do that one more time. As I'm typing text align, I love Atom because look at all of the possibilities it's showing me here. I can text align, decorate, shadow, indent. This is a great way to find a property to describe for the database challenge this week. But the one we're interested in is text align. I hit enter and it moves my cursor over, yes, but it also shows me all the possible values. So I don't have to look on the internet or the textbook. I can just see right away that I want to use center. And it adds a semicolon for me. So I added an element selector that selects, that might select a lot of things. That selects the div, but it's really all divs. So if I refresh this page, if I had any other divs on the page, they would all be centered. So this isn't the best selector. I did give you this extra little bit of classes that you can target. So if I want to write a class selector, that is actually something that I can write that's different than an element selector. A class selector begins with a period, and you just have to refer to the class that's in this attribute. So it's .goodluck. So I'm selecting all of the HTML elements that have a class of good luck, and I am asking that text to be centered. And if I go back and refresh, you'll see that it's still centered. So I guess maybe if I give this in a future semester, I will have two divs on here just to prove that this is, another div. So this will just be a plain div, some text that shouldn't be centered. Okay, so here's some text that shouldn't be centered. If I had written this style rule with a div selector, it would actually center both of these, and that's not what I was having you go for. So I really wanted you to write a selector that used the class feature of CSS. So there are class selectors that start with a period. There are also ID selectors, and I think we will look at one of those next potentially here. Well, I guess I don't see any IDs. All right. Well, anyways, this is way number 2 to include CSS. Does it look like it should? Well, it's getting closer. Does anyone know how we can change the black behind the word good luck? I'm going to give you a hint that has to do with the background. So as I start typing background, you'll see that background color is an option. So I can arrow down and choose that. And let's just call it black. We'll save and go back. And when I refresh, oh, it's black. And the word good luck is certainly in there, but it's hiding because the font color is black. So this is where you're going to want to play around with more of the values. Oops. Oh yeah, I want to leave the background color black, but I probably want to change the text color to white. So if I refresh that, it's getting closer. Now there are plenty of other properties for you to look for to try to make this uppercase, to try to make it have some padding, because it doesn't quite look like my screenshot here. It looks like there should be space inside the black background and maybe even outside of the black background. Those are like the padding and the margin properties. But you're getting along the right way. So what I want to transition to is the very first hint that we kind of skipped over here, and I want to write an external style sheet. So those external style sheets are really powerful because rather than having to edit every single HTML page to have its own style tags, you can actually write one CSS file and use it in multiple pages. So let's start by building our CSS file. I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to file, new file, and I'm going to put myself in CSS mode. So I clicked on the format in the bottom right. I'm going to go into CSS mode, and let's write a rule that targets this pro tip that has a class of resource. So let's select resource and set up a border. 1 pixel solid. I'm just going to do black for now. When I save this file, I'm going to save it in the same folder, so on my desktop here, and I'm going to call it brandonstyles.css. So I have this brandonstyles.css. That means in any HTML web page in that folder, I can actually make a link tag. And Adam's going to autocomplete. The place that we put the CSS file name is actually the href attribute. It's a lot like the anchor tag, except this is the link tag. I've personally always been amused by the fact that we include CSS with link tags, but we link to web pages with anchor tags. It never quite made sense to me, but you know, the anchor tag came first and CSS came second. So I'm going to have to type brandonstyles.css in here. But now, if I go refresh my page, you'll see that I've added a border around this paragraph tag. Now, this is not the right type of border. When you look at the screenshot, you'll see that the border is actually this dashed line. There is a different way to specify a different style of a border. And I expect that you'll be able to find that either in the book or by looking up some CSS resources. The Mozilla Developer Network is one of the best, but W3 Schools will always show up in the first search results. So if I wanted to look for how to make that border dashed, I could go to google.com and I could search for CSS border and let's do dashed. When I search for that, let's see what comes up. Well, I mentioned W3 Schools. That is actually the first 2 hits. And then the third is the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network. And then the fourth is actually a good one too. The CSS Tricks website is pretty good at describing how to use CSS as well. So these 4 links here up at the top, I am constantly going to these websites looking up the properties because I haven't memorized them yet. I will tell you that Atom and its autocomplete ability makes it a lot easier to figure out what these are. So now that we know that there's a border style, you'll see that once I have border style set, I can actually use my arrow keys to go up and down and find dashed. And now it looks a little bit closer to my screenshot. It's still not quite right. I mean, you can probably see the visual differences here, but we're getting there. So that's how to do the CSS 3 ways. What you're going to have to turn in is your completed HTML file, where I'll be looking for an example of an external style sheet, an embedded style sheet where you use the style tags, and at least one example of inline styles. I've had students complete this assignment in the past doing all inline styles. I really want to make sure that everyone has the practice with all 3 of these though, because when you're working on a web page in the future, you might find yourself needing to override a style sheet or add your own style sheet or just edit the styles on one page, and all 3 of these are really valuable. So those are the 3 ways to include CSS. When you go to turn in your project, I need this file, but I also need your external style sheet file. Otherwise, when I open up your project, I won't be able to see the CSS that you wrote. So do you have any other questions about the CSS 3 ways challenge? All right. So let's jump ahead. So a few more slides on this. I think you saw before that an external style sheet use that link tag, and then you put the path to get to your CSS file. There is technically another way to do an external style sheet, but I don't see it used as often, where you use the style tags, but then within there you can import. It's a CSS feature to import another file. I don't see that used very often, so I'm not having you worry about it too much. The more common way to include a style sheet is with that link tag. And notice how the link tag does not have a closing link tag. It's just an empty tag that opens and closes by itself. Embedded style sheets, just to review, rely heavily on the style tags. They open and close, and they generally are found in the head. Inline styles are much more tedious for you to write, and they rely strongly on this style attribute. And then you write your CSS declarations inside of here. You can imagine that that gets really long if you have a lot of properties you're trying to adjust. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about selectors and how they work. Next week, we're going to do a deep dive into the DOM, the Document Object Model. But you already have some experience with this from the HTML troubleshooting challenge that we did a couple weeks ago. I made a big deal about opening and closing tags in a very critical way, that if you open a tag and then you open a second tag, you are expected to close that second tag before you close what I call the parent tag. Now, when I use that word, that kind of implied a relationship between the tags that you open and close. And chapter 11, I think our author does a great job of expanding that concept out. So there are these awesome little diagrams throughout chapter 11 that talk about how a web page's tags can be visualized in your head. So everything starts with the HTML tag, and then it's broken into two sections, the head and the body. The body is where all of our content is, and where you might have your H1, your paragraph tags, and then in a paragraph tag you might have this emphasis tag. When you are opening and closing tags in a certain order, you are building up these relationships. So if I bounce back to this 3 ways challenge, Adam also makes these relationships very clear. When you open and close certain tags, like this HTML tag, that's closing all of its descendants. I can actually shrink this down and make my HTML show its children, which would be the head and the body. Notice how that aligns nicely with this diagram. If we open up the body, you'll see that I have this H1. It opens and it closes. So this H1 is considered a descendant of the body tag. The body tag is considered the parent of the H1. This next paragraph right here is actually considered a sibling of the H1. So I want you to start thinking about tags and the relationship this way, because it's going to be really important for CSS. One slightly more complicated example right here, we have the ordered list. The ordered list, as you can imagine, has multiple children. It has these li tags. And inside of the li tags, there's often another element, the code tag. So the code tag, or the code element, is a child of the li, which is a child of the ol. And the ol is considered a parent to the li tag and a parent of the code tag as well. So start trying to visualize your code as this tree structure, because you can actually write CSS that targets certain parts of the web page. If you wrote a paragraph selector tag, it would select all of the paragraph tags. And notice how M is also colored in here. The way CSS works, when you change certain properties, they are often inherited by their children. So if you're setting something like the font size and the font family, that property is actually inherited by all of the text children that exist underneath the paragraph. And that's actually really handy. So if you wanted to set the body color, if you want to change the color of everything on a web page, you would actually just change the color of the body. And you wouldn't have to remember to write a rule for every type of tag that you happen to use. So inheritance is really powerful, and it allows us to write that really short CSS. Thankfully, not all CSS properties inherit. In my head, I kind of intuitively know which ones will inherit or not. The best example that our textbook author gives is the border property. If you were to set the border on one element and then it was inherited by every element underneath it, you would have just like boxes on top of boxes. So generally speaking, the text, the things that change the appearance of the text definitely inherit, and the things that change color and background color inherit as well, so that if you made the body a certain background color, you wouldn't have to worry about setting the background color on every paragraph or every heading. So you'll get a feel for that as you use them. The C in cascading style sheets stands for cascade. And I think that this is a really important concept, because that's where the power of CSS comes from. We talked about how we can include CSS 3 ways. We can include it from an external style sheet, an embedded style sheet, and inline styles. And the truth of the matter is, you could actually write CSS in all 3. And it's up to the browser to follow certain rules or heuristics, the cascade, to figure out what style wins out. So the way that this works is the browser, as it's parsing and reading all these CSS rules, is it considers the weight. It gives certain types of CSS rules more weight than others. Weight is actually kind of complicated. There's like some math that happens in the behind the scenes, but you can boil it down to the priority of where the style comes from, the specificity of the selector, and the order that the rules come in. And I want to give you a really simple but powerful example of this. I used to do this activity where I had team red and team blue. I believe our textbook author actually takes it up a notch. Let me see if I can get ahead to it. We are tonight in the chat room. I need people to be on different teams. I'm going to need someone to be team red, someone to be team blue, someone to be team green, and we're going to figure out who wins. I'm going to take this CSS, paste it into my little CSS 3 ways just for fun, and I could put it in these style tags, or I could put it in my external style sheet. Sorry, I just want the paragraph pieces. There should be no HTML tags in your CSS file. I've made that mistake before. And I want you to point out that all three of these rules are pretty much the same. They all select the paragraphs on the page. However, the first rule sets them to red. The second rule sets them to blue. The third rule sets them to green. I need my teams. Which team is going to win? Who thinks the paragraphs on our webpage are going to become red? Answer in the Twitch chat room, telling me what color you think the paragraphs will be. All right, we got one vote for green. I don't see any votes for red or blue. I think you must have already played around with some CSS. Let's save, and I'm going to refresh my web page here. Boom. It might be hard to see. Let me zoom it in. I think that looks pretty green. We got a good Christmas pattern going on here, red and green. Yeah, it's green. So why is it green instead of red? Sometimes I'll have a lot of people that really believe it's going to be red, and I have a lot of people that believe it'll be green. I have to be honest, no one ever tells me that it's going to be this middle color. That's why I've boiled it down to red and green or red and blue. But the reasoning I hear behind people saying it's going to be red is they think that the first rule wins. It's the first rule that they see, so the browser's going to follow that. I think the logic for it being the last one probably intuitively makes sense. If you consider yourself a computer and you're reading a bunch of styles, and you start from the top and you start reading down, you're going to follow the instructions. You're going to see that it's going to say set all the paragraphs to red. You're going to do that. Then you're going to see set them all to blue. Oh, so you're going to do that. And then finally you're going to see set them all to green, and so you do that. That's why it wins, because it was the last rule of that specificity. It was the last paragraph selector, so it's going to set them all to green. Last rule always wins. Yep, that's what someone said in the chat room. That is absolutely right. So that is one way that the cascade works out. That when in doubt, if all rules are equal, the last rule wins. But there's a few other things that come into play, including the priority of the style rule source. And so what that means is, where is the rule coming from? Was this a rule that was provided by the browser by default? Because every browser ships with defaults. Was this a rule that came from the author of the website? Did they put it in style tags? Or was this rule provided by the preferences of a user? When they're visiting websites, did they say that they want a minimum font size and they want all backgrounds to be black? Those sources all have different weight. And usually what wins out is what the user's priority was. And then the website author's priority, and then lastly are the defaults that come with every single browser. So we're essentially writing CSS to override what the browser came with. Now, specificity is something that we're going to deal with a lot more in the next couple chapters. Suffice it to say that some of these rules carry more weight than others because they're more specific. So let me write a couple different rules here. If I wrote P color yellow, and then instead I wrote body P color red, keep these together. And then finally, I wrote P with a ID or a class. Sorry, let's say a class of special. I set that to blue. So I have 3 possible colors. I've got yellow, red, and blue. Which of these rules do you think is going to win? What color are the paragraphs going to be? Are they going to be yellow, red, or blue? And maybe it's not a one answer, but which of these rules feels more specific? Someone's saying red and blue in the chat room. You're right. Maybe this example they made off the top of my head isn't the most clear, but this rule isn't very specific. It's only saying all the paragraphs. This is getting a little bit more specific. It's saying all the paragraphs that are underneath the body. So when you write a selector that has spaces in it, this is called a descendant selector. You are saying, I don't want all the paragraphs. I want to find only the paragraphs that are under the body. And because you're adding all this extra context into your selector, you're filling in more pieces of that tree in your selector. That makes it more specific, and it essentially gives it more points and more weights, more weight in what gets considered. Now the last example definitely is way more specific because it is saying I want all the paragraphs that have a class of special. Notice how there's no space between the P and the dot here. This actually is going to line up with this type of an element. Now I know this is not valid HTML inside of the CSS file, but this is what this selector is trying to select here. This is a lot different. If I had a space in here, this would actually not be selecting this paragraph. It would be selecting anything with a class of special underneath of a paragraph, which is a little bit confusing. So you have to be careful when you're writing these selectors. The spaces matter. They change what you're selecting dramatically. But back to the way it was, this is way more specific because we're saying the paragraphs that have a class of special. So on a web page, if you had multiple paragraphs and only one of them had a class of special, you were absolutely right that you would see red paragraphs, and then you would see maybe 1 blue paragraph or 2 blue paragraphs, because remember, you can have multiple paragraphs or multiple items on a page that share a class. So you could have multiple special things on a web page, and it would change their color to blue. So let's get back to the slides here. So that's an introduction to the cascade. What it all boils down to is how is the browser going to figure out what an element looks like when there's multiple possible CSS rules that it has to sort through. And we're going to visualize that ourselves next week. At the end of this chapter, they talk about the web inspector in Chrome, the developer tools. If you read that, that's great. You have a preview of what we're doing next week. We're going to go through a little exercise where you'll play around with the Chrome developer tools. All right, so we talked about the priority, the specificity, and the rule order. One of the last concepts that's introduced in chapter 11 is about the box model. And I think it's neat that she introduces this because we aren't going to talk about border and background and colors for like another week or two. But this introduces a very important concept. Everything that's on a page, I think I've mentioned, is either like a block element or an inline element. Block elements take up like the whole width of the web page, and the next content starts underneath of it. You can see that when you enable something like a border property and you set it to blue. You'll see that on block elements like the H1 here. That extends across the whole page. Inline elements, like maybe the span tag or the M tag or the strong tag, those are considered inline elements, and they don't cause the browser to start on a new line. And more importantly, they can be inside of another block element. And the border, notice how it only surrounds the word. It doesn't surround the whole width of the content or the whole width of the page. So the box model kind of, if you boil everything down to it, everything that you're putting on a page is a small little rectangle that you can style. You can give it a border. You can do cool things like give it a background color. You can also add padding and margin. And we are going to explore that much more in depth in the next coming chapters. The book provides a lot of units of measurement that you might be working with. There are some that are more popular than others, but they can be categorized underneath absolute units and relative units. Absolute units are like real measurements that aren't going to change based on their parent or the things that they're surrounded by, or like the browser window. If you say that something is going to be 12 pixels, the font size, or it's going to be 50 pixels wide, you can expect that that will be 50 pixels on my screen and your screen. It won't be different. Relative units, however, are actually going to be based on something else, and they allow you to make a proportional design. So if you wanted something to be the 50% or 50 view width of the browser window, you can specify that with a relative unit, and then as you resize the window, it's always going to be half of what the space is available. So there's a nice sidebar in the chapter that lists out all of these relative units of measurement. I just wanted to point out a few that I know are used most. Pixels, we use those a lot. I don't think there are really any other absolute units that we use very often. When it comes to relative units, I used to always use the M's, but I think that this REM unit is way more popular now. Does anyone know what an M is, an EM? It's not the HTML tag M. That is something different. That is emphasis. But M itself is a very special unit of measurement that has a history that goes all the way back to the physical blocks that they used when they were in a printing press. Let me see if I can pull up the Wikipedia article for M. We want not arts and entertainment. We are looking at typography. M's, units of measurements. So you may not remember this, but the printing press, there were physical characters that were locked in, and one unit of measurement that was really popular was the width of a capital M. So when we talk about that as a unit of measurement, they actually added the E in front of it, so that the M is actually the width of a capital M at the current font size. And if I go back to my presentation, that's what this M unit of measurement is. That's why I used to use it. But it is relative, so if the font size of what you're looking at is like 24 pixels instead of 16, it doesn't work out so well. Let me see if there's a screenshot of how this works. 1M in a different font size is actually bigger on this right-hand side because the font size is bigger than the font size over here. So it might not be the most reliable unit of measurement. That's why they introduced the rem, which is a unit of measurement based on the font size of the actual web page, the HTML tag, whatever the font size that was set there. It's still a relative measurement, so if someone hit the zoom button in the browser, it would still like resize and get bigger and smaller, and it would all keep everything relational to each other. But it's a little bit easier to work with than using the M unit. So of the list of measurements that I think you're going to need to work with, pixels for sure, and I definitely recommend working with the rem for font sizes. These are two that are really new, the VW and the VH. They make it really easy to say that I want to set something 50% the width of the web page. You would call it 50 VW, and that would be 50 half of the web page, of the browser window, not of like the height of the whole page, just the browser window, the viewport. And that is super awesome if you're trying to design something for a mobile phone and you want it to be as tall as the screen size. I didn't know that these were such reliably available in browsers these days, and now that I've discovered them, I use VW and VH so much. Yeah, so next week, this is a preview. We're going to be talking about developer tools, where you can actually use parts of Chrome and Safari to look at the cascade and see what rules are winning out. So it's really cool. If you have some time, you can play around with it this week, but that's going to be a focus of next week. Let me bounce back and close Wikipedia and close CSS 3 ways. I think I still have Moodle open here in the background. Are there any other questions that you wanted to cover tonight, everyone? I think I covered a lot of the CSS concepts that I wanted to introduce. We went over the CSS 3 ways challenge. I have decided that the Google Fonts challenge will be for next week. I haven't been able to post it yet, and I don't want anyone to think that it's due Friday. So I'm going to just postpone that until next week. There is no journal this week. The quiz is available. I do need everyone to contribute to the database and example CSS property. I did take a look at those today, and I noticed that a few people had put HTML tags in there, so I'm trying to follow up with them to ask them to find a CSS property instead. The slides from today from chapter 11 have been posted, and there are also slides from chapter 12 that I'm not going to go over here, but you can look at them on your own. That might help you out. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat room. I'm going to give the chat room another minute to catch up. I appreciate everyone's diligence in trying out CSS. I know that it's always a little overwhelming at first, but once you kind of get a feel for the power of it, it's really addictive. And CSS is how you can make a web page look really awesome. All right, no questions in the chat room. Oh, actually, here's one. We're able to reference the database throughout the semester, right? Yes, that is the whole goal of these databases, because like even the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, and the CSS Tricks websites and the W3 schools, those are available. You can definitely browse those, but they're overwhelming. They list every CSS property that exists. Those CSS properties that your fellow students are sharing are actually the ones that you'll likely be using more often. So I definitely want you to be able to go back and read the CSS properties and read the HTML tags. In fact, I would encourage you to try to go read the HTML tag database today. I think I have it set up that you can see it even after that week ended. I know I've looked at it a couple times. Oh, someone said that the HTML one is locked. Well, that is a bummer. Let's see if I can fix that. I need to go back to the whole class. HTML tag database. I will try to get that unlocked. Edit settings. Availability. I think the option that I want is underneath there. Oh, available to. That's probably the problem. Save and display. Okay. For whoever said that they tried to get into the HTML one, would you try again and let me know if it's visible? You can follow up with me in the Slack chat room. I think I'm going to log off. There's no other questions here. Thank you for pointing that out. I'll make sure the CSS one continues to be available too. Thanks for joining and watching, everyone.